and welcome to another recording session for Based on a True Story. In this session, we're going to be recording an audio podcast about the movie Hidalgo and look a little bit more into the real events that happened and compare the movie with history. Now, if you've watched a recording session for Based on a True Story before, then you kind of have an idea of what we're going to be doing here. But if this is your first time, first, welcome. Again, I mentioned this is an audio podcast, so I'm not really going to be focusing on the video. What you're watching is not the final product. This is the recording session that will then turn into, after it's edited, we're not going to edit it in this video, but this will then turn into an audio podcast. So you're going to get to see all my mistakes and everything as the camera rolls. I think that's pretty much it. So let's dive in here. First thing I want to do is arm my track. So you can see my screen here, and you can see how that works. So save this. And I like to make it a little bit bigger just so I can see it a little bit easier. All right, so let's get started with this recording. Joe Johnston has directed some great movies, including the recent holiday-themed film, The Nutcracker. Oops, messed that one up already. I didn't like, the pacing wasn't right. It's actually The Nutcracker and the Four Realms. Oh, and that reminds me, one thing, so I record a few months ahead of time, so this movie isn't actually out yet, The Nutcracker and the Four Realms, but by the time this episode, the Hidalgo episode, will be released, it will have been. So, yeah, I record a little bit ahead of time. Joe Johnston has directed some great movies, including the recent holiday-themed film, The Nutcracker and the Four Realms, that just came out. But he's got a long history in Hollywood. If you're a Based on a True Story producer, you'll know a few of his films we've covered on minisodes like Captain America, The First Avenger, or The Rocketeer. Then there's other classics, the original Jumanji, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and Jurassic Park 3. Okay, maybe that last one isn't really that much of a classic film, but today we're going to be learning about one of the few films in Joe Johnston's career that, as of this recording, is the only film he's directed that's rooted in history. I'm Dan Lefebvre, and this is Based on a True Story. I'm going to rephrase that because today we're going to learn about one of the few films, and then it's the only film. So I'm going to redo that. I'm going to delete this, and let's just do that whole thing over again. So what you can't see is the script. I have that off screen there's only so much screen real estate that I have to work with here. And so you can't see it, but if you want the transcript when the Hidalgo episode goes live, it'll be up at basedonatruestorypodcast.com. I post those up there. So today we're going to learn about one of Joe Johnston's films. That's a little bit easier. All right, so let's do this again. Joe Johnston has directed some great movies, including the recent holiday-themed film, The Nutcracker and the Four Realms, that just came out. But he's got a long history in Hollywood. If you're a Based on a True Story producer, you'll know a few of his films that we've covered on minisodes like Captain America, The First Avenger, or The Rocketeer. Then there's other classics, the original Jumanji, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and Jurassic Park 3. Okay, maybe that last one isn't really much of a classic film, but today we're going to be learning about one of Joe Johnston's films that, as of this recording, is the only film he's directed that's rooted in history. I'm Dan Lefebvre, and this is Based on a True Story. All right, so that's the introduction part. Now I'm going to give myself a little bit of space here so that when I'm editing, I will know that this is the intro, this is Two Truths and a Lie, and then kind of the meat of the episode. So again, this we're not going to be editing in this video. I do have other videos of editing sessions, so you can kind of see how those work. But that's at a different time. So let's get into the next part. Before starting our story today, let's set up our game. 2 truths and a lie. If you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'm about to say 3 things. 2 of them are true, which means 1 of them is a lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number 1, the Ocean of Fire race wasn't real. Number 2, Frank never worked for Buffalo Bill. Number 3, Frank T. Hopkins wasn't a real person at all. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, you'll find the 2 facts scattered somewhere throughout the episode, and then by a simple process of elimination, you'll find out which one is a lie. And of course, we'll do a recap at the end of the episode to see how well you did. Oh, and if you want to check out those other minisodes that I talked about of Joe Johnston's movies, the ones about Captain America, The First Avenger, and The Rocketeer, those are available exclusively for Based on a True Story producers. You can sign up to become one and get access to those and all of the other bonus content over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/support. Once again, that's basedonatruestorypodcast.com/support. But for today, messed that up. But for today, let's buckle up for an epic race as we learn about Frank T. Hopkins and the movie named after his horse, Hidalgo. All right, so we have introduction, 2 truths and a lie, and then I'll give myself a little bit more space for editing just to know, and then the bulk of the episode. So let's Yeah, okay. Let's get going. Our movie today begins with some chilly scenery. We see trees, sun, and snow-covered fields. Then there's shots of cold, brisk water covered by ice. When we hear a whistle, we see the head of a beautiful brown and white Mustang. That's when we see Viggo Mortensen's character, Frank T. Hopkins, enter the movie for the first time as he pets the horse that the movie is named after. In the next scene, we get a bit of context for what's happening as we see Frank riding Hidalgo and catching up to another rider. The other man mentioned something to the effect of, "I didn't ride 1,100 miles to come in second place." The race is on. And, of course, Frank wins. After this, we see the text on screen that we're familiar with in a little bit of a different version. It says, "Based on the life of Frank T. Hopkins." The movie doesn't give us any sort of indication of what race this might be that we're seeing, and unfortunately, it's not something we can really figure out by looking at it from history. And this is where the first major controversy about this film begins. You see, even though the movie says it's based on the life of Frank T. Hopkins, there's a lot of people who would disagree with that statement. Perhaps a more accurate statement would be that it's based on the stories Frank T. Hopkins told about his own life. On one hand, this isn't really anything new. We hear amazing stories all the time that make their way to the big screen. But for the most part, those stories have been able to be verified in some way through accounts other than the word of the one who claimed they happened. Sure, some people like T.E. Lawrence, whose name became famous by the film Lawrence of Arabia, might have embellished their story a bit, but we can verify a lot of it through documentation. Even stories like Hugh Glass, who we learned about in The Revenant, are mostly believed, even if there wasn't anyone around to document or verify it. But when it comes to Frank T. Hopkins, things get a little more difficult because you'd think we would have scores of documented proofs about the things he claimed to have done. But we don't. For example, Frank wrote stories about him being the teacher to the infamous Billy the Kid. He said he hung out with Teddy Roosevelt before he was the president of the United States, and that he served as inspiration for the legendary Western author Zane Grey. He even said he was a secret agent, and plenty more. But, as it turns out, those are more likely than not nothing more than tall tales. We don't even really know when Frank T. Hopkins was born. He claimed to have been born in 1865 in Fort Laramie, Wyoming. He even conflicted himself a little bit by claiming two different locations. They're two different distances from Fort Laramie in his own stories. However, historians have struggled finding any documentation to prove that's where he was born. Of course, on the other hand, that's not too surprising. It's not like we have proof of everyone's birth dates in the 1800s, especially in remote towns like Fort Laramie. For a bit of context, in 2010, there were 230 people living in Fort Laramie. In the 1860s, Fort Laramie was little more than a station for the Pony Express. So even though we don't know when he was born, we do know Frank T. Hopkins existed, so obviously he was born, right? Going back to the movie, the next major plot point has Viggo Mortensen's version of Frank headed to Wounded Knee. It's here that the movie tells us the year for the first time. We see text that says we're at Wounded Knee Creek on December 29th, 1890. Frank is a dispatch rider. He's taking a message that we saw handed to him in the opening sequence to the commander there at Wounded Knee. For some reason, though, he doesn't take it to the commander. He instead hands it to a soldier that then must run all the way across the camp to deliver it. Maybe the purpose of that is just so that we can hear the voiceover letting us know what's inside the message. And the message is to Major Whitside of the 7th Cavalry. It says that General Miles is ordering a solution to the Sioux uprising. He's ordered to disarm the Indians at once, and if they fight, subdue them. Then, as Frank leaves the camp, we see one of the Indians carrying a rifle. One of the U.S. cavalry soldiers tells him to give up his gun. An elderly tribesman comes by saying that Black Coyote is deaf. He can't hear your orders. A struggle ensues, and the gun goes off. Then, all hell breaks loose as the soldiers open fire on the Indians. That is true. Probably. What the movie is showing here is what's referred to as the Battle of Wounded Knee, but some have debated that name, saying it wasn't a battle at all. It's the Wounded Knee Massacre. We don't know for sure how the bloodshed started, but there is a version of the story that says it happened just like the movie shows. The Lakota tribe, which is one of the three major divisions of Sioux tribes, was at Wounded Knee when the 7th U.S. Cavalry tried to disarm them. One of the tribesmen, named Black Coyote, was deaf and didn't want to give up his rifle. In the scuffle, his gun went off and the cavalry started shooting. The Lakotas tried to fight back, but most of them had been disarmed. And in truth, they didn't really have that many guns to begin with. On the U.S. side, there were 490 men. 25 were killed, 39 were injured, and 6 of them succumbed to their wounds later on. For the Lakota, there were 120 men who fought. We don't have exact numbers, but some estimates say 90 of those warriors were killed, along with another 200 women and children slaughtered. To date, the Wounded Knee Massacre stands as the largest domestic massacre in U.S. history. And the movie got the date correct. It was on December 29th, 1890. For the purposes of our story today, though, what's not true about this is that Frank was there. He was not at Wounded Knee on that December day. Now, it is true that Frank claimed he was there, like the movie shows, but historians haven't been able to find any proof to back up the claims that Frank made that he was at Wounded Knee when the massacre took place. We have documentation from the events, including stories from the Indians who managed to survive the horrible event, but none of them mentioned Frank being there. Back in the movie's timeline, we see some text on screen that tells us we're 8 months after Wounded Knee, and we're at Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. We hear J.K. Simmons' version of Buffalo Bill announcing that the Proud 7th was awarded 27 congressional medals at a place called Wounded Knee. What the movie is referring to here as the Proud 7th is, of course, the 7th Cavalry. As we just learned, it is true that the U.S. troops who were involved in the Wounded Knee Massacre were the 7th Cavalry Regiment. As for the 27 medals, however, that number is a little bit off. Some sources that I found said that there were 20 medals of honor given out, while the official U.S. Army website has 18 men listed receiving the award. For a bit of comparison, a total of 7 men from... Man, I got a lot done, but messed that a little bit up. It shouldn't have said 7 men from. It was 7 men in. For a bit of comparison, a total of 7 men in the 7th Cavalry Regiment earned a Medal of Honor for the Vietnam War. Admittedly, the Medal of Honor was awarded more liberally in the late 19th century, but still, that number seems quite high for something that many historians consider to be a one-sided engagement, the number of medals given for Wounded Knee. In other words, it was not a battle, it was a massacre. In the movie, we see Frank performing as one of the heroes of Wounded Knee for Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. He's obviously not too happy about the role that he's playing, as evidenced by how drunk he seems to be all the time. But he plays it nonetheless. It's true that working for Buffalo Bill's Wild West show was another claim of Frank's. However, there's also no documentation to prove it ever happened. Dr. Judy Winchester was the curator of the Buffalo Bill Historical Center in Cody, Wyoming, as the movie was being made. In a 2003 interview with the Saudi-based newspaper Arab News, she explained, quote, "We were unable to find any Frank T. Hopkins in our database of known cast members, acquaintances, employees, or friends of Colonel Cody," end quote. Back in the movie, it's during one of these shows that we see Viggo Mortensen's version of Frank get approached by an Arabian man named Aziz. He's played by Adam Alexei Mal, and along with his British colleague, the two convince Frank to take on a new challenge. They talk about an amazing race called the Ocean of Fire. According to the pair, this is a race that's taken place every year for more than 1,000 years. It's a 3,000-mile race across the Arabian Desert, along the Persian Gulf and Iraq, across the sands of Syria to Damascus. Of course, Frank, decides to take Hidalgo on this long, ultimate, the ultimate long, not long ultimate. Frank, of course, decides to take Hidalgo on this ultimate long. So this is a note to myself because I said of course, and really I should have said Frank, of course, not of course Frank, which might throw me off in editing because I'm listening for the same words. So that's a note to myself later in editing. Frank, of course, decides to take Hidalgo on the ultimate long-distance race. Now, I don't want to be the cloud that rains on this parade, but none of that is true. Do you remember the year that we saw in the movie earlier? It's 1890. Guess what? Iraq didn't exist in 1890. The country of Iraq that we're familiar with today was formed in 1919. The lands that make up the modern-day country of Iraq was owned by the Ottoman Empire in 1890. An empire whose demise began in 1918 but officially didn't collapse until 1922. So there's no way this 1,000-year-old race could have included Iraq like the movie claims. But what if we gave the movie the benefit of the doubt and just assumed that they're letting us know about the lands we're familiar with now as Iraq? After all, it's easier to say Iraq to give us an idea of where they're talking about than to explain everything I just did about the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Still, it fails. You see, there aren't any records that any experts have been able to find about a man named Frank T. Hopkins ever entering into Arabian sands. There's also no record of a horse named Hidalgo taking place in the Ocean of Fire race. Of course, there's probably a good reason for that. The Ocean of Fire race isn't real. You'd think there would be some form of paperwork, documentation, or history that we could find about a race that was supposed to take place every single year for over 1,000 years. But there's not. Frank made it up. Great story, but not real. All right, I'm going to have to pause the video real quick and then restart it, and I will be back in one moment. All right, I'm back. So the reason for that, having to pause it, it's just because the camera that I'm using a Sony A7R II to record. That is, it only does 30-minute clips at a single time before it just stops. And so I have to stop it and then restart it. I have a little timer down here that lets me know when I'm nearing half an hour or so, and so I can stop and start. So you'll notice a cut every so often, and that's what I'm doing when I do that. All right. So what was the last thing I did? Let me listen. For 1,000 years, but there's not. Frank made it up. All right, right here. And since that gives you an idea of how real the rest of the movie is, we could end this episode here. Of course, you're free to do so. This is a free podcast, and you can skip to the next episode in your queue of awesome podcasts to listen to. But before we do that, if you're like me, you're probably wondering, if Frank T. Hopkins wasn't at the massacre at Wounded Knee, didn't work for Buffalo Bill, and didn't race in the Ocean of Fire race like the movie claims, what did he do? I mean, other than make up some very tall tales about his own life, that is. Well, the sad truth is, we just don't know a lot about the real Frank T. Hopkins. A big part of that is because we can't really trust most of the things that he wrote. And a big part of that is because of the things that he wrote, most, if not all, start to fall apart when you dig deeper into the story. We don't even really know when he was born, as we mentioned earlier. Maybe it was in 1865, as he claimed, or maybe, as some historians believe, he was really born in 1884. That's quite a big difference and would have made him just 6 years old in 1890 during the timeline of the movie. And while Frank didn't work for Buffalo Bill, we also know that in 1926, he did hold down a job in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, working for the company digging the subway system. In fact, for all we know, Frank may have never even lived in the West. He may have dreamed up all those stories without ever living anything close to them for real. Well, maybe. Some believe the closest Frank came to riding in long-distance races was when he worked for Ringling Brothers Circus handling their horses. Still others believe that perhaps Frank did everything he wrote about, we just don't have any documentation to prove it. That's certainly possible. There are countless stories throughout history that haven't been documented. There's no way to prove. Oh, I messed that up. Hold on. And that's certainly possible. There are countless stories throughout history that haven't been documented. There's no way that we can know about them after all. We can't prove something we can't prove, right? As for Frank T. Hopkins, probably the biggest gaping hole that I found in the documentation for his stories had to do with all of the long riding races he claimed to have been a part of. You see, Frank's claims span over 400 races. To be more specific, those races include 1 in England, 3 in Germany, another 3 in India, 4 in Italy, another 4 in Russia, yet another 4 in Singapore, 5 in Mexico, 5 in France. You see, Frank's claims span over 400 races. To be more specific, those races include 1 in England, 3 in Germany, another 3 in India, 4 in Italy, another 4 in Russia, yet another 4 in Singapore, 5 in France, 11 in Mexico, 14 in Mongolia, 38 in Japan, 68 in Argentina, and last but certainly not least, a whopping 289 races in the United States. That's 444 total races if you were counting. And for all of that time spent racing horses, there are exactly 0 photographs of Frank T. Hopkins sitting in the saddle of a horse. And that's it. It's a short and sweet episode. That kind of happens when everything's made up in the movie. So, of course, I mean, like I said, there are people like that I found, like the author of the movie itself, as well as, others that do believe Frank actually did everything. But I mean, come on, there's no it seems to be no proof of that. And for, a race that supposedly happened for thousands of years, you would think that we would have something. This episode of Based on a True Story was written and produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. If you want to learn more about the real Frank T. Hopkins, you should check out the book simply called Hidalgo. It's a collection of Frank's writings, but There was a team of historians and experts who have gone through the book and pointed out the accuracy, or maybe I should say the inaccuracy, of the claims that Frank is making. For example, they do a great job of explaining how Frank's stories have captivated great journalists and authors and convinced them, for some reason, to publish the stories without any proof. Then it was really the movie that we're talking about today, Hidalgo, that brought a new wave of attention to the legends of Frank T. Hopkins. When historians started to dig deeper into Frank's stories, they started to realize there's a problem when you try to verify them with a third-party source. You can't. So if you want to dig deeper into the results of all that research in a way more depth than I could ever go here on the podcast, check out the book Hidalgo, published by the Long Riders Guild Press. I'll make sure to include a link to that and plenty more resources to start learning more about the real story behind the movie Hidalgo over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. As a refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie. Number 1, the Ocean of Fire race wasn't real. Number 2, Frank never worked for Buffalo Bill. Number 3, Frank T. Hopkins was not a real person. Did you find out which one is a lie? The lie is number 3. Well, Frank may have come up with some tall tales in his day. He was a real person. There's just not much proof about anything that he claimed to have done being real. Of course, there's always the chance that we simply don't have that proof yet. With each passing day, we learn more about our past. We find new clues to help uncover stories that were once lost to time. Maybe one of these days, we'll learn even more about the real Frank T. Hopkins. And that brings us to an end of our story today, but there's always more history to learn. If you've already listened to the 100 or so of the past episodes of Based on a True Story and are looking for something new, check out some of the mini-sodes by becoming a producer for Based on a True Story. Supporting the show costs as much or as little as you want. There's no tiers or anything. It's a pay-what-you-want model. And by signing up, you'll get exclusive access to bonus episodes looking at how history was portrayed in fictional movies like Twister, The Prestige, and Jurassic Park, just to name a few. To grab those, sign up to be a producer over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/support. Once again, that's basedonatruestorypodcast.com/support. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll chat with you again really soon. All right, and that is the end of our recording for today. So this one is going to be a shorter episode, it looks like, but sometimes episodes are shorter, sometimes they're longer. It kind of depends on the story that we're telling. So thanks again for watching this recording session. Keep an eye out, and I will try to also remember to record while I edit this so you can see the editing side. And check out some of the other recording sessions or editing sessions. Or if you want to hear the final product of this, you can subscribe to the show. Find out how to do that over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/subscribe. And you can find all the links there. You can also just search for Based on a True Story in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, really whatever app you use, it should be in there. So, yeah, thanks for watching and have a good week.